I am Professor Victor Murinde, the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium, AERC. This is the Pan-African institution headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome today to the AERC VOICE, the voice of the African Economic Research Consortium network on the very particular and critical issues that are shaping economic development in Africa. And today, we are going to look at the reimagining East Africa's trade and investment agenda in a fragmented global economy, and looking at what is happening around the world and try to see how Africa can be able to transition from aid to reliance on trade and investment for funding economic development on the continent, country by country, region by region, and the entire continent together. So for today, we have a panel of very informed researchers and network members, and I would like to ask them to introduce themselves. I will start now on my right-hand side. Please, Peter.
My name is Professor Victor Murinde from University of Nairobi Department of Economics and Development Studies. I'm one of the network members of AERC, and more importantly, I'm an alumni of AERC.
Thank you. Next.
My name is Malcolm Gitau. I'm a graduate of the Collaborative Masters in Agricultural and Applied Economics. That makes me an alumni of the AERC. Recently, I've worked in the private sector and the development space, and I currently work as a researcher in the Office of the Executive Director, AERC.
Thank you very much, Marco. Diana.
Thank you. I am Diana Wanjiko. I am currently a researcher at the AERC and a network member. I am a master's graduate in economics, and I also have a first degree in the same field from the University of Nairobi. Thank you.
I am Dr. Abi Kadir, the Director of Research of the African Economic Research Consortium.
Thank you very much. So we have a panel here discussing and exploring, having conversations about trade and investment in the Eastern African region. And we're going to explore a number of issues, just normal discussion, and proceed from there to be able to bring out some conclusions on the key aspects of what is driving trade and investment in the region. But first is the criticality of this debate. It is so timely. Okay. This now is pronounced at the end of aid. That is dependency on concessional financing that started in 1945 at the end of the Second World War is drawing to a close. And countries, including especially African countries, especially South African countries, have to fund themselves using alternative methods. So it is a question of aid or trade and investment. What is your take, given the research that you are leading in the AERC for many years, and of course yourself as a distinguished researcher in this area of economic trade, economic integration, trade, and aid? Abi.
Thank you, Victor. This is very timely. It is not surprising that this trade, not aid strategy is dominating the debate. It is here to stay with us, and it is part of the reconfiguration of the engagements that rich countries are having with the continent of Africa. I say reconfiguration because the recent reading of the strategy, which is pioneered by USA and also followed by other rich countries, clearly indicated that they are very keen to engage with Africa, but reconfiguring it by focusing on partnerships, particularly focusing on private sector development. As I said, this shift is here to stay, and it is happening, and there is no way back. However, I put the following question, and I'll try to reflect on it. What is Africa doing when this major shift is happening? Trade, but not aid. I say this for the following reasons. If you look at what African governments are doing, I don't think the momentum is matching with the momentum that we see from advanced economies. That is one. Second, they are not making concrete and effective effort to create the environment for the private sector, job creating and economic growth expanding investments by cutting most likely the most controversial aspects of curbing or reversing the illicit financial flows that is leaving the continent. But let me come back to the compelling narrative statement that you made when it comes to the trend that we are witnessing. If you look at the debate about trade but not aid, I've put the following controversial point forward. Trade and choices of aid are not mutually exclusive. Even the statistics that is being floated around indicates that aid is still relevant. Therefore, it is a false dichotomy when we say trade but not aid. It doesn't mean that we are pulling out of aid completely. I should conclude by saying that we need aid, but the relative weight of aid is declining, and it is here to stay in that declining trend, and they play a complementary role.
Thank you very much, Abi, on clarifying this argument about trade rather than aid and pointing out the possible continuity. I think the demand for aid will be there on the countries that have been depending on aid. The question is, will the supply remain or will the supply dwindle so that we can see the matching of the supply and demand for concessional financing, and the financing that has a grant element of 20% is classified as aid resource flows to the countries. But then the other option, of course, is on trade rather than aid. But we wanted first to see, we're focusing on East Africa, and we'd be interested to see the intra-East African trade. East African countries are trading among themselves. So let me turn to Diana, who has also been looking in these questions. What's the big picture today about intra-East African trade?
Well, Victor, the big picture is mainly that we are shifting from aid. And like we know, the trade right now is growing at a high trajectory, especially from the 2020 to 2025 with the crisis that happened that showed us that as Africa we need to develop sustainable strategies for economic growth. So we see that in 2023, trade grew by around 13% to 12.1 billion USD, which means that we are following the trajectory. We cannot get rid of aid completely, but we are moving towards self-sustainability. Still, there is still a lot of potential within East Africa and within Africa as a whole. The regional trade can grow because as we see, while this trade is increasing, it's still 15% of the total merchandise trade within the globe. So meaning there's a lot of potential. Another good thing is that most of the trade within the region is on manufactured goods. Meaning that if we were to work on the infrastructure and the investment and the systems that will boost regional trade, we can grow not only in volume, but also in value compared to the trade that we used to have, the traditional kind where Africa is mainly a primary goods export. So if we move towards manufactured goods, then it means that our trade will grow and we will be moving towards a self-sustainability. And like Abi has said here, we will be developing a collaborative relationship with the global north rather than a relationship based on need.
Thank you, Diana, and for giving those interesting numbers and giving an overall picture on intra-East African trade. But you did mention that it also depends on investment. So I'd like to turn to Peter, given your research and observations in this area, and ask about intra-East African investment than trade.
Yes, thank you.
Who is investing where? What's the big picture?
Yeah, the big picture is that if you look at the statistics in the last 2 years, specifically for 2022 and 2023, you find that intra-East African trade investments going to Uganda have declined marginally. Investments going to Tanzania have declined marginally. Investments going to Kenya have declined in a very big margin. Investments going to Rwanda have risen sharply. Investments going to Burundi have also grown sharply. And therefore, the $1 billion question is why? What explains the big jump for investments going to Rwanda, for investments going to Burundi? When you look at the World Bank data, 2024, the business-friendly report, it shows that Rwanda tops in all the African countries in terms of business regulations, friendly business regulations. That explains the big jump of investments going to Rwanda. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for being able to look at those individual countries and give us an indication of what is happening where and who is investing where. So now it's been argued in some quarters in terms of the big picture on our radar that the East African community is a rising investment frontier. Malcolm, I know you have been peering into this direction. What do you see?
Yes, that is absolutely true. The East Africa is a rising investment frontier because we had the customs union in 2005 that made trade duty-free among East African countries. Then in 2010, we had the common market that allows for free movement of people, free movement of goods and services. So that facilitates trades in Eastern Africa. And the exciting news today is that we have several areas, cross-cutting areas of investment, starting with manufacturing and industrialization. I strongly believe that no country can make good economic growth without significant investments in industrialization and manufacturing. We had the East African Industrialization Strategy in 2012. This is a strategy that was adopted by the East African countries, but it's 13 years later, we are not seeing any significant improvements because in most of the East African countries, manufacturing accounts for less than 10% of GDP. So it is an area that we need to give priority in terms of moving from exporting raw materials to using those raw materials to process goods that we can actually export. It's a very interesting paradox that actually we are importing raw materials. We are exporting raw materials, then we end up importing goods that have been made from the same raw materials. So we need to invest in processing, value addition, so that we can also export processed goods. Another area of investment is in agriculture and agribusiness. The East African community holds 60% of arable land in Africa. There is a famous trade economist called Heckscher Hollin, who say that countries export those goods that abundantly use their factor they have. So in Africa, we have land and labor. We need to also focus on agriculture. But again, we are exporting raw materials, yet there is a room or potential to invest in value addition of these materials so that we can export processed goods. There are also other areas of investment in Africa. Currently, there is rising finance in green energy. It is good that God has blessed East Africa with abundant energy sources like geothermal in Olkaria, Kenya. We have a hydro energy in Uganda, solar and wind. So it's another good area of investment, green energy, because most African populations, I think 50 million of African citizens in rural and peri-urban areas are not connected to electricity, yet we have these sources that can be used to connect them to electricity. We also have the digital economy and the technology. It's a rising area of investment in East Africa, especially in mobile payments. In e-commerce, we have agri-tech and also health tech, amongst tourism, mining, and other priority areas.
Now, briefly, I'd like to continue the conversation further and look at the types of financing for this investment, and especially the prospects for leveraging on trade. What do you see how we can leverage, Diana?
Okay, from what I see, the main way we can leverage is FDIs, financial development, and that has been the main source of income apart from aid, apart from trade. It has been one of the biggest source of wealth for Africa, but that cannot be the only one. We have portfolio investments, venture capital, private equity, which will actually boost startups, help the private sector grow. We have remittances, which have been growing since 2020, and they're good for household consumption, for small businesses. When these remittances get into Africa, they not only boost the economy, they also help on an individual basis. So with these levels of income, we cannot depend on one source for sustainability. So we need multiple sources for Africa to actually grow and be sustainable in its way. These inflows from the other country, apart from aid, these inflows will actually boost innovation. Things like venture capital, things like the private equity, boost a lot of innovation for startup businesses to be able to grow and scale. They help in household consumption. They boost the household, that small businesses within the household can actually grow, and that speaks to the economy. They also help in infrastructural development, development finance from financial institutions like AFDB, World Bank. Such institutions are really key. Like Malcolm, my colleague, has said, we need the infrastructure and the industry to be able to match the level of trade that we intend to. So without development finance, then the industry will not grow. It will take a long time before we actually reach the level of other economies. So we need development finance, and these things will deepen the financial markets, and we will be able to not only grow, but be sustainable as a continent. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diana. Important observations. I know we are running short of time, but a number of areas we need to touch on. We haven't talked about unlocking East Africans' digital potential. We haven't talked about China in Africa. We haven't talked about challenges and opportunities. So to cover these areas, what I'd like to do is to give each one of you just 1 minute and focus on one. And if one person has focused on the other, just skip it and see what you can focus on. Just 1 minute of explaining any of those aspects. Is it China in Africa, China in East Africa? Is it the East African digital potential? Is it opportunities and challenges? What is it? So I'll go around, starting with the Peter and ending with the Abi. What are your final thoughts on this question that Eastern African countries have to boost their trade and the investment so that they're not worried about any stoppage or slowdown in aid funding? We can finance our own growth. Peter.
Thank you. I'll talk about 4 key challenges that can boost trade and investment. And one has to do with political stability, because this has implication on investor confidence. Any FDI of portfolio flows that are to come into East Africa, political stability is very important. We know there are problems in South Sudan, Somalia, and DRC. The other key challenge is regulations uncertainty, whereby you have complex regulations, you have multiple licenses, you have inconsistencies, you have less bureaucracy in obtaining registration permits, in electricity connections. And such challenges will always hamper investments and trade. Then you have another key challenge of inadequacy in infrastructure. So you have infrastructure gaps. And here I'm talking about the roads, the railways, and the inefficiency of our 2 major ports. That's one of Mombasa and the other one of Dar es Salaam. And the other one, the other challenge that I would want to mention has to do with energy connections. While you have average energy connections in sub-Saharan Africa at 50%, that of East Africa stands at only 39%. So if we were to boost and enhance investments and trade across East Africa, these are challenges that must be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, those challenges very well enumerated. Marco, what are your parting shots?
Okay, yeah, my parting shot. As we've seen in East Africa, we have very good treaties, we have good agreements, but still trade is lagging. So we need to close the gap between policy and implementation. I earlier mentioned that we have this East African industrialization strategy. It was adopted a long time ago in 2012. But why is it that we still have challenges to do with trade? That means that something somewhere is not being done right. We have a lot of papers, we have a lot of books, a lot of policy briefs in the shelves hanging. So we need to move them from policy to implementation. And once we implement these good strategies that we have, then we are likely to see an improvement and a positive trajectory in terms of intra-East African trade. So the time to act is right now. We implement what we have in the shelves and everything will be fine.
I absolutely agree with you. Carry on. Yes, Diana, your parting shots.
Thank you. So I would say that we need to accept that aid is dwindling and actually think of strategies to be sustainable as Africa. And we need to move to a level where we collaborate with the Global North on a relationship that is collaborative, that is not them handing down support, but for us to actually speak on the same table and say, this is what you want, this is what you want, let's collaborate to have global growth. And I believe that trade and investment within Africa, infrastructural growth, and political stability, they are all important. They are all pathways to this kind of relationship that we want as Africa, so that we are not seen as beggars anymore, but as people, as policymakers and key aspects, key critical factors to the growth of the whole world.
Absolutely. Abi, your final parting shots.
Yeah, if you allow me, let me flag two important items of discussion. One is the role of China in trade and investment trends in Africa. And I would like to also conclude by giving a continental, a Pan-African view of the AfCFTA to really bring together all what colleagues have said. When it comes to China, this is in reference to the China-Africa Bulletin research that we are undertaking. We published 2 bulletins since 2024, and there are interesting trends from that data that we have looked at, both for 2024 and currently as we go for 2025. If you look at the data from 2000 until 2023, except for a dip in investment between 2016 and 2019, the export to China is increasing. Imports of China from Africa is increasing. Particularly if you look at exports between 2022 and 2023, there is a 34% jump of Africa's exports to China. So there is a very important player which should be counted. So China is doing very well. One thing I would like to highlight in relation to China is the following. China's imports of ores, critical minerals from DRC is declining, mainly because DRC said we would like to have a value addition on the resources that we export to China. In much supporting way what Diana has said. If they are looking for value addition for the DRC colleagues, I think the challenge is more structural, that is applicable to DRC as well as broadly. If you want to have a value addition, you need skills. If you want to have a value addition, you need energy, because we have interruption in terms of electricity. And finally, the global financial architecture is also against us when it comes to the trading as well as investment. So that is my submission in relation to China. But to conclude, in a Pan-African context, AfCFTA provides market for 1.3 or even more than 1.3 billion Africans, and it is a market of continental proportion with the GDP of 3.4 trillion at least. However, the implementation of the AfCFTA is challenging, and African governments should really look at themselves and see what they have signed up to and ratified to implement it. For instance, there is lack of transparency in terms of the tariff schedules. Most countries are investing and trading on REC terms, or the regional economic community terms, as Malcolm's and Diana's example showed. Therefore, that is one, the implementation. More importantly, I think most of us here, we agree that the intra-Africa trade is only 16% of the total trade potentially that we should really be having. Why is that low? The major reason is, in our recent publication, we showed that most of the trade that takes place is cross-border trade, and it is not registered in official statistics. The 2023 ECA study shows that between 30 to 70% of official trade is actually informal cross-border trade. So how do you measure informal trade? That is very difficult. How do you finance? That is very difficult. Therefore, we should really focus on measurement of ICBT to have a realistic statistics of intra-Africa trade, and we should have a data hub and a data platform for trade statistics in Africa. These are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Abi. Thank you, Abi, and thank you to all the panelists. This is just the first of many other interesting conversations that will be taking place under the platform of the AERC VOICE. We'll be talking about further debate on China in Africa. We'll be talking about fintech, unlocking the fintech potential of Africa. We'll be talking about critical minerals. We'll be talking about industrial policy. We'll be talking about skills and the youth in Africa and the jobs. We're talking about economic growth strategies that can drive Africa the highest trajectories ever in the future. Also, of course, debating the issues around the African Continental Free Trade Area. All these issues we shall examine. For the time being, let me take this opportunity to thank the panelists. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, Diana. And thanks, Abi. And thank you all those groups of people who have been here to support this conversation. Thank you also for listening, if you are there and listening to this conversation. Thank you.